Was Matthew 24 and 25, this incredible prophecy of Jesus, was this fulfilled in history in 70 AD? Is this a prophecy that will be fulfilled in the future? Or is it a mixture of both and a happy medium in between? That's what we're going to look at today. This is a bonus session that accompanies the Maranatha Global Bible Study that is running alongside of the Maranatha fast that's happening right now between March 25th and April 8th. You're welcome to jump in and join us with this for this fast. You're also welcome to jump in on the study. We're working our way through the Bible, looking at key end-time eschatological passages. We'd love to have you jump in with us. Thousands of brothers and sisters all over the world are doing this study together, and it's been an amazing experience so far. You can get it for free, video, audio, and notes. You can go download the app from any major app store. It's all free on the Frontier Alliance International app. So let's jump into this. I'm going to give a number of reasons, 8 to be precise. I'm going to give 8 reasons why I don't believe that Matthew 24 and 25 was fulfilled in history, and why it's not a mixture of the two. This is an explicitly eschatological prophecy, and it's important that we understand that because it has profound implications, consequences, and ramifications if we believe something else. And I'll explain what I mean by that, why, and how that is meted out as we go through this. To begin, I want to quote one of the premier leading scholars and theologians of our day who believes the opposite, just to give you an idea of what the contrast in the different views are here, and then we'll work our way through the reasons why I don't believe that this is actually a faithful reading and application of the text. This is from N.T. Wright, who is, again, probably one of the most renowned theologians alive on the earth today. He says this in his book, Who is Jesus? He says, when the Jewish writers spoke about the sun and the moon being darkened, when they spoke of a son of man who would come on the clouds, they meant this in a metaphorical way. Quote, it is flagrantly absurd to think that Jesus, in saying this sort of thing, that he would come back, envisioned himself or anyone else literally flying around in midair on an actual cloud. This is in direct reference to Matthew 24, where Jesus said, at the end of the age, you'll see me coming on the clouds of heaven, coming in great power and great glory. N.T. Wright says this is a metaphor, and it's absurd to believe that Jesus actually meant he would return in power and glory in the clouds. In his book, Jesus and the Victory of God, he says this, the coming of the Son of Man does not refer to the second coming in the modern, scholarly, and popular sense of a human figure traveling downwards toward the earth on actual clouds. The coming of the Son of Man is thus good first-century metaphorical language. He goes on to argue that when it said that Jesus will come on the clouds at the end of the age, he actually meant Jesus would go away on the clouds at the end of the Jewish age, when, in fact, the privileges, identity, and destiny of national Israel were stripped from her and applied to, attributed to, bestowed upon the new true Israel, the church. This is actually one of the reasons why I believe it's such a destructive teaching, is because it's at the foundational bedrock of basic street-level replacement theology. This is the reason why so many in our Bible schools and seminaries bought into replacement theology, because they bought into Matthew 24 and 25 being a metaphorical event that doesn't speak about Jesus' return to Jerusalem, but speaks about Jesus going away in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed and Jesus ascended some decades earlier. And somehow that's supposed to be a coherent, intelligible one event that Jesus referred to. So let's look at this. Let's just work our way through it. 8 reasons why I don't believe that Matthew 24 was fulfilled in history. Reason number 1, because the question that provoked the answer, where Jesus talked about him coming on the clouds after the abomination of desolation in the holy place in Jerusalem, that would cause a great tribulation such as the world has never seen ever or nor ever will be, that culminates in his appearing, the gathering of the saints, and the end of the age. That statement was given in response to the disciples asking a question. They asked this in Matthew 24, verse 3. Jesus, when will these things be, the destruction of the temple, the invasion of Jerusalem, and your second coming? When will these things be? What will be the sign of your return? And what will be the signs of the end of the age? Those are their three questions. Jesus is answering their question. When, for example, if I come to you and I say, hey, you're watching a movie, when's this movie over? And you look at the time and you say, it has an hour left, it'll be over in an hour. That means it will be over in an hour. When the disciples came to Jesus and they said, when will the end of the age be? Jesus answers their question and says, this is when the end of the age will be. And they ask, what will the signs of the end of the age and your return be? And Jesus answered, the signs of the end of the age and his return. He wasn't addressing 70 AD because the age didn't end and Jesus didn't return, unless you want to do crazy linguistic gymnastics and say he came in a phantom way in judgment, judged Israel, stripped Israel of their identity, placed it on the church, and went back in a phantom way up into heaven, where he's now sitting and waiting for us to come meet him. This is totally unintelligible. It doesn't make any sense if grammar and language mean anything. If I ask Jesus, when will the end of the age be? And he gives an answer, meaning he didn't push them away. He didn't say, guys, don't bother with that. No, he gave them an answer. He explained it to them. He's kind like that, which is a reason why I love Jesus. When we ask him questions, he answers them. And sometimes he answers in riddles and enigmas, but sometimes he answers very clearly and simply. And in Matthew 24 and 25, he answered it very simply. This is when it will happen. These will be the signs. Now, N.T. Wright, again referring to the preeminent scholar of our time, he dodges this by saying something very interesting. He said that Jesus didn't teach about the end of the age. He was referring to the end of the Jewish age, because the Jewish people were subsequently stripped of their identity and covenant privileges. This is replacement theology. Israel's cast away, we take their place. Jesus didn't mean what he said, that he would come on clouds. That's a metaphor, and it's absurd to take him at his word. I don't think that this is a responsible way to treat the Bible, and it's definitely not academic or intellectual, which is interesting why academia in theological institutions believe this to be the gold standard baseline for how to interpret Matthew 24 and 25. It makes no sense. The second reason we don't believe it happened in history is because of the grammatical integrity of Matthew 24. What do I mean by that? In Matthew 24, the Lord is going to use a number of statements like these things in those days. If you go through the chapter, you're going to see that the birth pains of verses 4 through 8 are connected to the social pressures of 9 through 14, which are connected grammatically and chronologically to the abomination of desolation in verse 15, which sets in motion the great tribulation in verse 21 that culminates necessarily in the return of Jesus in verses 29 through 31 and the gathering of the saints. Which is why then Jesus would say this generation that sees all these things will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Meaning this, all these things are inseparably connected together. You can't pull them apart. Meaning the abomination of desolation, the destruction of the temple, you can't separate that from the final tribulation any more than you can separate the abomination of desolation from the second coming of Jesus and the gathering of the saints. If language means anything, you have to see, say, acknowledge, and affirm that every event from verse 15 to verse 31 happens in one generation, in one lifetime, in one 42-month period. Or, here's your other option, you can spiritualize and allegorize and make metaphor out of the whole passage and say that the destruction of the temple in verse 15 was literal, But the second coming of Jesus and the gathering of the saints in verses 29 through 31 was figurative, was spiritual, was metaphorical, and it's absurd to take it literally. So my question to N.T. Wright or to anyone that affirms this is, why are you asking us to believe that the destruction of the temple was literal and the abomination of desolation was literal, but the coming of the Lord and the gathering of the saints was metaphorical? Where do you draw the line in knowing what's literal and what's metaphorical, especially in a passage where there just is no metaphor? Meaning, in the parables, he's using metaphor and he's using allegory. But in that prophecy where he's answering their question, there's not a single symbol. There's no metaphor. There's no allegory. He just says, this will happen, abomination, great tribulation, sun, moon, stars, second coming, gathering. It's very simple. The third reason is this: because of the second coming, beloved. When Jesus mentions the abomination of desolation, he mentions it in context to the end of the age and his coming. Remember, the key question, Jesus, what will be the signs of your coming and the end of the age? And he puts the abomination of desolation as the primary catalytic event and the primary sign of his near return. It's the single event, in fact. There is no other event in Matthew 24. Now, there's trends, earthquakes, wars, famines. There's these things, but those things aren't signs. Those are the beginning of birth pains. The primary sign generationally is the abomination that causes desolation in Jerusalem, that impacts Judea and the surrounding wilderness nations, that sets in motion a time of tribulation. In verse 29, Jesus says this: immediately after the tribulation of those days, you will see Jesus coming. Which means this. He says, hey guys, I'm coming at the end of the Great Tribulation. And you say, well, Jesus, when will the Great Tribulation start? He says, when the abomination of desolation happens. So how are we to believe then that verse 15 happened in 70 AD and verse 30 and 31 happen in the future? So again, we have our three options. Did it all happen in the past? And this is all metaphorical, but kind of not metaphorical. Or maybe it's a mixture. I was talking to a theologian a number of years ago who said, no, look, I'm not a replacement theologian. I love Israel. I stand with Israel. I believe in the future grace for Israel. But Matthew 24, part of it was fulfilled in history. I said, well, how do you decide that? He said, well, because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. I said, well, fair enough. I affirm that it was too, but it wasn't the abomination of desolation that kicked off the Great Tribulation, was it? Was this the Great Tribulation that touched all nations? He said, well, no, I guess not. So, well, how then can we believe that it's a mixture when Jesus says explicitly, the tribulation of those days, after that, I will come? That's a very important point. Reason number 4, because the gathering of the saints. Jesus connects, because here's the thing. You can say, okay, Jesus, his coming actually meant, they do lots of gymnastics with the original language, and they talk about how his coming actually refers to something else and the Perusia, and they go into all this different language and play with the language and say it doesn't actually mean his coming, it means his revealing or his disclosure, and it's talking about him revealing himself in judgment in 70 AD, which he did come in judgment, so that's what that means. Okay, so let's just assume for a minute that that's true. Jesus actually was referring to not his actual physical return, which poses problems once we get to Matthew 25, where Jesus says he'll sit on his throne of glory and judge the nations. But let's set that aside for a moment. Jesus is saying not only that he's going to come in some way, maybe in a phantom, metaphorical, allegorical way, but he also says that he's going to gather the elect from across the earth. So my question is this: when in 70 AD maybe he did come in a phantom way, and maybe I'm missing it, but explain to me how the saints were gathered together. You say, oh, they were gathered together in prayer. They were gathered together in a mystical way. He's gathering them together, guys. Let's not play with things and let's not let the facts confuse us here. He's gathering the saints on the day of his return, which goes hand in hand with what Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2. Concerning the day of the Lord, which is the day of the coming of our Lord and our gathering together to him. That day will not come until the falling away happens and the Antichrist is revealed. So again, you're stuck in a scenario of trying to separate his coming from our gathering from the day of the Lord, and it just doesn't work. That's the fourth reason, because the gathering of the saints didn't happen, guys. Maybe Jesus came in a phantom way, but he didn't actually come and set up his throne in Jerusalem as he said he would at the end of that passage. And he definitely didn't judge and separate the nations in 70 AD. He judged Israel with the nations as a rod of chastisement, but he didn't judge the nations in 70 AD. Matthew 25 says when he returns after the tribulation of those days, he's going to judge and separate the nations. That didn't happen in 70 AD. Reason number 5 is this: because there was no abomination of desolation in 70 AD. There just wasn't. There was the destruction of the temple, but even then, the way it happened is very not abomination of desolation. It didn't happen in the holy place. There was not a defiling event that's described in the book of Daniel where Jesus got the term from anyway. What happened in 70 AD? The Roman army took the area, finally broke through, suppressed the rebellion, took the city of Jerusalem and said this: guys, don't touch the temple. Don't touch it. It's a hot potato. Leave the temple alone. Hired Arab legions, defied the order of the commanding generals, and attacked the temple and lit it on fire. Runners came to the general and they said, "Hey, general, the Arabs lit it on fire." And he said, "Oh no, this is going to be a colossal headache. This is terrible. Go scrape the gold off of it," which is why they rolled the stones down, scraped the gold off of it, and rolled the stones down into the valley, just as Jesus prophesied. But the point is this: there was no abomination of desolation described in the book of Daniel. It just didn't happen in 70 AD. What happened in 70 AD? Rome took it and said, "Don't touch the temple." Arabs lit it on fire. That's the extent of it. Now, the persecution of the Jewish people and the violence and the death toll was massive and catastrophic for sure in the first century in 70 AD that led to Masada. Massive. But there was no abomination of desolation, guys. I'm not denying the fact that there was a great trouble and there was a great tribulation in those days, but it wasn't the great tribulation. Why? No second coming, no gathering of the saints, no abomination of desolation. Which leads to our next point, number 6. Because of the resurrection of the dead. Jesus is quoting Daniel 12 when he talks about the great tribulation such as never been nor ever will be. That's a direct quote from Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, where Daniel is having an encounter with an angel, and the angel says this: "In the days of the abomination of desolation, there will be a great trouble such as never been since the world began nor ever will be." But he says this: "In those days, fear not, Daniel, because your people will be delivered, and many in the dust of the earth will rise in resurrection." Which means this: the passage that Jesus was quoting in Daniel 12, in Matthew 24, connects the abomination of desolation with an unequaled, unprecedented, age-ending crisis, tribulation, that culminates in the physical, literal resurrection of the dead. Now again, your option here is to deny the resurrection and to say that it's allegorical and metaphorical. He meant salvation of the world. But that's not what he said. The angel said resurrection of the dead. And the author of Hebrews, by the way, calls teaching about the resurrection of the dead fundamentals. Remember where he said, hey guys, let's move on from the elementary things, from the laying on of hands and baptism and the resurrection, which means this was a basic assumption. The actual resurrection of the dead that happens at the return of the Lord, that happens at the gathering of the saints, that happens after the Great Tribulation, that happens because of the abomination of desolation. The seventh reason why we don't believe it happened in history is because of this issue of the deliverance of Israel. I'm going to mention a few passages here. You can write them down and look at them later. In Daniel chapter 12, where he references Daniel, there's coming a time of great tribulation after the abomination, such as never was. But fear not, Daniel, for your people, the holy people, your people will be delivered out of it. The deliverance of the Jewish people. In Jeremiah 30, verse 7, he says this, there's coming a time of great trouble for Jacob, for Israel. But Jacob will be saved out of it. Zechariah 13, 8 and 9 say this, that during the great tribulation, it says 2/3 in the land will be cut off and will perish. 1/3 will be brought through the fire, and they will be my people, and they will say, you are my God. In Matthew 24, he says that when Jesus comes, it says all the tribes of the land will see and mourn for him. That's a quote of Zechariah 12:10. Where those tribes who are alive at that time, the Jewish people in the land of Israel, will look upon him whom they pierced and mourn for him. This is very important. Catch this. In 70 AD, the events of 70 AD brought about the judgment on national Israel, the scattering of national Israel, and absolute carnage against national Israel. It did not bring about the redemption, the restoration, the deliverance of Israel. Why is that important? Because if you say that Matthew 24 was fulfilled in 70 AD, you're actually saying that 70 AD accomplished the exact opposite of what all the prophetic texts say about the final tribulation, the final abomination that causes the desolation that sets in motion the tribulation, namely the deliverance of Israel. Meaning, no deliverance of Israel, no fulfillment. This is the linchpin. Without the deliverance of Israel, you have no fulfillment of the abomination that causes desolation. Interestingly and conveniently, Mr. Wright and those who embrace this replacement theology, it's very convenient because metaphorical theology goes hand in hand and fits very nicely with a historical fulfillment. Meaning they feed each other, which is what I mentioned at the beginning. If you believe that it was fulfilled in history, I guarantee you probably believe in some capacity that Israel was divested of her identity, in part or in full, and divested of her destiny in part or in full. That is something that the Bible will not permit us to do. And lastly, number 8, which is a very important one, given the dynamics that are taking place on the earth right now with this whole corona catastrophe and phenomenon. And it's this, because of the global dimensions of Matthew 24. When we go through Matthew 24 and 25, I want to encourage you to circle or highlight or just count on another piece of paper how many times Jesus mentions nations, how many times he mentions the whole earth or the whole world. Guys, in Matthew 24, these events are global in nature. 70 AD was very local in nature, meaning it was a limited military campaign of the Romans against the city of Jerusalem. The rest of the world didn't know about it. They just didn't know about it. And the crisis Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24, verses 4 through 8, he says this, look guys, all nations are going to be involved in this, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And verses 9 through 14, he mentions all nations in two very significant ways. The first time he says, all nations will hate you. Which means this, if all nations hate you for his name's sake, that means all the nations know his name, which means that the gospel will have spread beyond Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth. But what happens in the first century is not that. Now, the disciples gave it a pretty good go. I mean, they touched the far corners of the Roman Empire within their lifetime, but the whole world did not know. All nations, all tribes and tongues simply did not know in the first century. The next thing, it says, when the gospel of the kingdom is proclaimed to all nations, then the end will come. And now we're ending where we began. Point number 1, the question informs our interpretation of the answer. The disciples were asking, when will these things be and what will be the sign of the end? And Jesus says this, when the gospel of the kingdom is proclaimed to all nations, then the end will come. And after all nations deliver you up to tribulation and attempt to kill you, then the end will come. This is a global event, not a local one. And we'll end with this. In Matthew 25, we call it the parable of the sheep and the goats. We really shouldn't call it a parable. It's a prophecy, not a parable. Jesus is actually going to sit on his actual throne, actually in Jerusalem, and actually judge actual nations for their actual decisions against actually the least of his brethren, the Jewish people, who are going to endure this final tribulation in a unique way. And he says this, I will gather all the nations before me, and I will separate them as one separates sheep and goats, one for blessing in paradise, and other for eternal condemnation and judgment. Guys, the culmination of Matthew 24 is Jesus, the man that we love and follow, sitting on an actual throne in Jerusalem, having inaugurated an actual government and judging all the nations of the earth. So I leave you with this question. Can someone explain to me how and why we are to believe that in 70 AD, Jesus came and judged all the nations and separated them as sheep and goats? Can someone explain to me how Israel was delivered in 70 AD? It doesn't look like they were delivered. It looks like they were judged, scattered in exile. Can someone explain to me how the gathering of the saints happened in 70 AD? Or how the resurrection of the righteous dead happened in 70 AD? Or how all nations were caught up in this great drama in 70 AD? Or how Jesus came back in 70 AD? Or why we're supposed to separate passages that Jesus grammatically bound together and said, don't separate them? If you can answer that, then I'm open to reconsidering the possibility that maybe Matthew 24 and 25 refers to history past or some hybrid combination mixture in the mushy middle in between. Otherwise, I think all of us should prepare for a future time of birth pains that lead to a future abomination of desolation that sets in motion a future time of unequaled tribulation that sets in motion the actual events that lead to the actual, not metaphorical, but actual return of Jesus to gather his elect, deliver Israel, raise the dead, judge the nations, and bring this present evil age to a close and a climax for his glory. Maranatha.